name is Gretchen Garrison, and my maiden name is Michaels. My parents live still in the area. My dad, Dale, was a longtime Lincoln family physician, and my mom, Raylene, kept us all going. And my brother and sister and their families still all live in the area, so I feel really blessed by that. So my husband, Kyle, and I have 4 kids. Right now they're ranging in age from 11 to 17. And we live on an acreage just west of Lincoln because that's where we run our business. So I was a Lincoln Christian graduate, and I went on after graduating from Northwestern College in Minnesota to teach at Lincoln Christian again. That was not my intention when I went to college, but I ended up going back there, and I taught 5th grade for 5 years, and that was actually my grade of choice, so that was kind of fun. And so I definitely started as a teacher, and I think I've continued as a teacher. I still homeschool my kids. Right now they're ranging in age, like I said, 11 to 17, but they're in 6th grade to 12th grade. So I will have my first graduate hopefully this year. And then, but I feel like with writing, I've continued to do the teaching because of the books that I write. My goal is to tell people stories in an interesting way that they do not know that they are learning. And I think that's kind of the goal of every teacher, is to just engage people in such a way that they aren't getting stuck on the fact that they're doing math, but they're gaining a better understanding of the world. I am a native of Nebraska, and other than my 4 years in Minnesota for college, I have lived here in the Lincoln area within a half an hour of Lincoln all of my life. And so definitely I think that makes a difference in writing about Nebraska, just because I grew up doing a lot of the things that I ended up writing about. And so I think that's really a fun connection. What happened was, when my kids were younger, we were in part of a group called Mothers of Preschoolers, MOPS. And so I was in charge of publicity. This is kind of how I got started in writing. And so every 2 weeks, I wrote a 4-page newsletter, because that's exactly what a mother of preschoolers should be doing, is reading a 4-page newsletter. But it kind of developed my love of writing again, that I had forgotten. I used to write some in high school. I wrote a lot of poetry, actually, and gave it as gifts. But then what I ended up doing is did this publicity, but then my kids were getting older. And so I thought, I can't keep homeschooling, even though they had a tutor when I was there. I can't keep homeschooling and doing extra things. And so I took a step back, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll write a mom blog someday. But I was out running one day, and I distinctly felt God whisper in my heart, I want you to write about Nebraska. And since that idea came out of nowhere, I was like, okay, this must be what I'm supposed to do next. And so I started just collecting stories, and my 2 oldest were going to be in 3rd and 5th grade. And as anybody knows that's from Nebraska, 4th grade is the Nebraska year. And so I couldn't hit them both in 4th grade, but I thought, well, this will work well. I'll have a 3rd and a 5th grader, so we'll study Nebraska. And so that really helped me to, when I visited places, ask more questions and to make a point of actually going places. And so that was definitely fun. So I do feel like that because I had developed a love of Nebraska, first back in 4th grade with my teachers, and then another influence on my writing is the books of Stephanie Grace Whitson, she's a local Nebraska author who has now become one of my friends and a big encourager. And she also wrote books that intrigued me, that I thought, I never really had thought about some of the backstories of some of the places I enjoyed visiting. So Nebraska's definitely played a big part in my writing. So the other writer that I've really enjoyed from Nebraska is Beth Streeter Aldrich. And what's funny is now I can remember that I first read A Lantern in Her Hand back in 8th grade, and I really enjoyed it. And I didn't really think too much about it. But then when my daughter and I visited her house out near Elmwood several years ago, I started talking to the person who runs the foundation there. And so I ended up actually talking about her books and how much I had enjoyed them. And I said, I really want to try to read all of her books. And I said, maybe I'll write study guides about them. So that's kind of led to an interesting collaboration. So I've written several book guides for some of the Bess Streeter Aldrich books on behalf of the foundation. So that's been kind of a fun project and a way to pay tribute to a lot of people that may not realize with Bess Streeter Aldrich is she was the most prolific magazine story writer of her time. Like, she was writing several stories a year for magazines. It was amazing. And so some of those short stories have been compiled into books, and then she did write several novels as well. But so I've definitely, she was an influence as well, just because she knew how to describe, and she wrote about where she was. She didn't try to write about things she hadn't experienced. And then when she hadn't experienced certain things, such as pioneer life, she would ask her readers to send her stories. And that's how she wrote some of her books. And so I find that to be very fascinating as well. I think when I wrote my first book called Detour Nebraska, Historic Destinations and Natural Wonders, I told people that I was writing a book. And I think when I started writing my second ones, my second and third book, I started saying I'm working on a book. And I think that's the point at which I realized that this isn't maybe a hobby anymore. Like when I was doing the initial Odyssey Through Nebraska blog posts and how I got started with writing about Nebraska, I don't know that I would call it a hobby because I spent quite a bit of time on it, but I don't think I really comprehended the fact that, oh, this is going to possibly take over my life and shift it in a different direction, because I definitely did not think about writing books at that point. Like, that wasn't my goal at all from the beginning. But I started writing beyond my blog, though, later on that fall, because I reached out to Mark Schwaniger at the Elle magazine, and I pitched a story idea to him. And I really hadn't been enough in writing circles to get the fact that you don't just randomly contact some editor of a magazine like without carefully preparing things. And I was like, I had this idea. I think your readers would like it. And he's like, okay. And so I've written more than 20 articles for the Elle magazine through the years. I'll have another one coming out here in November 2020. And so that's been a great working relationship that I didn't anticipate. And I've gotten to interview a lot of people in the area about different things that they did around Lincoln and businesses that they run or different outreaches that they do. And so that's been really great. I used to write poetry and I would frame it for people. And then I journaled for a while. And then I started writing for this MOPS, Mother of Preschoolers group. And I think that I really enjoyed that a lot. And so I would say now that I don't know that a week has gone by that I haven't written something. I write almost every day various things. Lately, I've turned to writing Instagram posts and write longer than just a sentence or two, just because I've really enjoyed the camera aspect of it. That's the one part about writing I didn't anticipate with the type of writing that I do, is I have to take my own pictures or else I have to pay somebody for pictures. So I've gotten a lot better with the camera. If you would have seen some of my early blog posts and my early pictures, you would have never thought that girl should write a book someday and take her own pictures. You would have been like, yeah, no. So that was kind of an interesting thing as well. And I've come to really enjoy trying to, I think people sometimes can enjoy pictures. You know, picture is 1,000 words. And so sometimes that can be a fun part as well, is learning how to tell a story through the camera. How I started with writing books was I actually got an email from Amy at the History Press who said, I found your blog, it's really fun, would you like to write a book? And I honestly almost deleted it, and I thought it was a spam email because we all get things like that with offers, and I'm like, okay. But I started checking into it, and I had read books that were by the History Press, but I didn't know it. And so I started checking in, and actually I checked with Stephanie Whitson, and I said, have you heard of this publisher? Do you think this is a legit thing? And she said yes. And so I started talking more to Amy and got everything lined up and decided when I talked to my family and I talked to my friends and I prayed about it, I felt like this was something that I was supposed to do. And so Detour Nebraska came about because she had asked me specifically to write about Nebraska. And so this book is not necessarily completely a travel guide because I do give the background of different places. But what ended up happening, again, because I had to take my own pictures, is I set out on a 1,700-mile journey across Nebraska in 4 days to take pictures to go along with my stories. I knew that I could research from my house, but I would want to be at the sites and I would want to really experience and talk to different people. And so thankfully my parents and my husband were able to watch the kids because that 1,700 miles with 4 kids would not have gone well. But with me being able to go early in the morning until late at night, I covered most of Nebraska. And then later on that fall, we took what my family likes to call the longest trip across Nebraska because my husband had said, you can finish up your pictures later, we'll go with you. Yeah, that didn't work very well. Are we still in Nebraska? Yes. Why are we still in Nebraska? We're supposed to go to Minnesota. I'm still working. Are we still in Nebraska, Mom? Yes. So it was a little easier when I did the traveling by myself. But so basically what inspired the book was the initial request. But I loved the fact of getting to tell more about some of the places in Nebraska that people don't know. They know a lot about the Omaha Zoo. They know about the Capitol in Lincoln. They know about children's museums in different parts. And so it was great to be able to visit some of these far off places that maybe people do not know. And there's so much more to Nebraska than people see when they drive along the interstate. They think, oh, Nebraska is flat. Well, one interesting fact, and I did share this in my book, is Nebraska actually changes more in elevation from the southeast corner of the state to the northwest corner of the state than the elevation changes between that corner and the East Coast. And so there's a lot of different scenery that changes and landscapes that changes. And so I loved to be able to get to tell that story and just to explain that there's a lot more to Nebraska than people recognize. Yeah, so my theme definitely probably is reflected because of my educational background, because I think I want to tell people stories. I maybe even consider myself more of a storyteller than a writer in the sense that that's what I want to share, because what do we remember? The stories. And from the beginning, people would tell stories around. And so I want people, when they're traveling around, to see that there's more to certain places than meets the eye. And that is definitely my influence and my goal. And so all 3 of my books, because I did go on and I was asked by the History Press to do another book. And so that one is A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, which is basically a travel guide to Lincoln's history. And so I spent a lot of time in this room, the Heritage Room, doing research and giving Diane the big pile list of books that I needed for her to find for me. Because we in Lincoln have been blessed with some great historians. Jim McKee and Ed Zimmer have both done a wonderful job of telling Lincoln's story. And so I wanted to go a bit farther back, and that's why I came here and read a lot of original manuscripts, and I used newspapers.com to really try to find some of the original stories, the ones that had been lost. And so that definitely is important to me, is to keep some of that history going. As a mom, I rarely get to have uninterrupted time. I feel like when I wrote books, I would spend more devoted time. Right now that I'm telling people more about my books, I'm not really getting to write as much as I would totally like, other than sharing pictures through Instagram. I think that will come. I'm hoping to catch up a little bit on some of the posts that I had in mind to put on my blog. One thing that I've started doing is seeing Odyssey Through Nebraska as an extension of my books. And so some of the stories that I maybe didn't get to fully tell, or as new information develops, then I get to tell it more fully. And so I probably tend to work in snatches. I definitely have woken up many early mornings to write. And actually with A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, because of the amount of research that was involved, I actually stayed up all night a couple of times just because I needed it to be quiet, and my family needed their mom. And so that meant that even though I would try to tell them, I really can't help you at this current moment find your dad, it doesn't seem to matter. They always gravitate towards mom. So my third book, 100 Things to Do in Lincoln Before You Die, that one was actually written in a much more condensed time. And I feel like because of the fact that I was really writing 130 words or so per place, the writing part of that to a certain degree was maybe easier. And so thankfully I didn't have to pull any more all-nighters. But afternoons are probably my favorite time to write, because then if I can teach my kids in the morning and get them going on all their projects, I try to do devoted times then. This fall, it is not quite working that way because my kids are doing youth sports, and so I've kind of had to adjust. But I've learned over the process of doing this now for 7.5 years that there will be more time later. And so even if I'm not quite getting to all my things that I have in mind, it'll come. And I feel like that's made me, I think I was more a frantic writer in the beginning, and I posted a lot, and I went back and read some of those posts. I'm like, oh, wow, those were really kind of awkward or whatever. And now I feel like I'm more purposeful because I've had a little bit more time to really take my writing seriously. So with Detour Nebraska, I did do some of the research on site when I traveled around the state, but I also picked up brochures. And my mom, being the wonderful resource for her teacher daughter that she is, had saved a bunch of brochures. And so then I did phone calls because I couldn't go on site to all of these places. And I had talked to people through the years. But it was interesting on some of the Detour Nebraska research because I tried to check in with places as much as possible and have them read over for accuracy to make sure everything I did was correct. And there were several times when the place would be like, well, that's not right at all. That's not true. And then they'd be like, where did you get your information? And I would be like, your brochures. And so that was always a little bit funny to be able to help them. And as I've learned now, as I've been doing the second book, there is one funny story with Detour Nebraska. I did get an email several months ago from a lady who said, I think that one of the things you included in the Saline County part is actually in Michigan. It's not in Nebraska. So I actually need to tell the publisher that, oh, by the way, please delete this really short paragraph. But I don't think it talked about Saline County, and it never said the word Michigan anywhere. And so it's just funny. So even though I try to double check and triple check, I still can miss information. So with the 100 Things to Do in Lincoln, that book was easier to research as far as I just talked to the people. I did use a little bit of the newspapers.com to look back at old newspaper issues on certain things, but mainly I talked to people so that, other than sometimes we would hit and miss each other in communicating. But with the History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, I did look a little bit at Jim McKee's books because they're incredibly well done. Remembering When was one of my favorite ones that I looked at. But I also tried hard not to look too much at his books because I didn't want to rewrite anything that he had done. And so I definitely spent a lot of time reading like A.J. Sawyer's books and reading. I would take pictures of my phone of the different resources and then go home and transcribe them. I also used note cards. My English teacher would have been proud to write down a lot of notes. And so I have way more than enough research for the book. I could probably write another volume. But the other really fun thing I did for research is one thing that Lincoln is known for is its strong church history. And so there have been several churches that have been around almost the whole time that Lincoln's been a city, if not the whole time. And so I went to those churches, and several of them had kind of museum rooms almost, and they had their own archives. And so I would go there and they would tell me different things. And again, I read way more than what I needed, but I just tried then to pick out some of the stories. So I think that's what makes my book unique as well, because I didn't just rely on what was easily obtained. I actually went to the places, and I tried to do the same with some of the buildings. The interesting thing, if you read the book, that you'll know is a lot of times the buildings aesthetically appear as they would have appeared long ago, but the interiors are definitely changed. And so that was a little bit sometimes of a struggle because obviously the building ownership had changed hands as well a lot of times. And so I would just do what I could to visit the places that were still around and talk to people that knew people. And so one other fun one that I did was I stopped at a store to ask questions if they knew the history of the building. And to my surprise, the gentleman's like, well, I don't know a lot, but here's the original deed. And so what was really cool was to see one of the deeds that was actually once owned by the original Lincoln postmaster, Jacob Dawes. And so to see his signature on this piece of paper that was just in this guy's desk drawer was amazing to me. I thought, wow, I mean, I don't think, he's like, I thought about getting rid of this. I was like, I suggest you don't. Do not get rid of this. This is a big deal. Just to see the signatures of some of the early Lincolnites, that was a thrill to me. And so there were times when doing this type of research kind of would be tiring just because I would have to think outside of the box. But I would like to think that paid off. And I definitely think that part, the people part, always made me excited about telling the story because I wasn't then just telling something from a newspaper. I was telling about real lives. I probably have more of a storytelling bent as far as I'm hoping that I don't sound like I'm lecturing. My husband has been known to try to encourage me to not use my teacher voice on the children because it does come out sometimes. But I do think that I try to figure out ways to make the information interesting. And so I don't know if I completely have a different style or a voice. I feel like with nonfiction, that's a little tougher. I don't know if people, I do feel like because I've written a lot of stories for the Elle magazine and done these books, I don't know if people would pick up an article and be like, that was definitely written by Gretchen Garrison. So I don't know if I have a distinct enough voice for that because I think a lot of people have read articles that I've written and not even know that I have written them. And I actually, in some ways, really like that, the fact that since I'm writing about a state rather than writing about my own life, I feel like that helps me to be a little bit more anonymous and it helps the state to shine through and Lincoln to shine through now as I wrote Lincoln books and the people that I'm writing about to shine through, and that actually really appeals to me. So I don't know if I'm going for a particular voice, but I know that with fiction you can definitely tell certain writers, and I would have to ask some people, maybe I'll have to ask my mom or my dad who have read a lot of the things that I've written. They would maybe be able to tell me if I've written a voice. I've never thought about if I have a distinctive tone. So when I have written my books, especially the first two that I wrote for the History Press, Detour, Nebraska, and History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, I have to assume that I am going to have an audience of distinct people in the sense that there's going to be one group that is going to want to read the books at home just to get the background information because they enjoy it. But then I will also have another group that will hopefully keep the books in their car and then as they travel about, go to different places. And so that's kind of different. So I have to make it interesting enough to come alive to the person that maybe isn't at the location, and then interesting enough to bring out the location if they're actually there. And so I would say that probably a lot of my readers are either retired, but I definitely, because I am a homeschool mom and I am a teacher, I probably write to homeschool moms. If you know a homeschool mom, you know that she is probably interested in a lot of things and forever asking questions, which is what I do naturally. And so I would say my audience definitely would be more toward that bent. Now with 100 Things to Do and Lincoln Before You Die, that one is different because for the most part, while somebody might read the book and not go to the places, this is more of a tourism book. And so I feel like for that one, I really needed to write to all audiences. And that is a little bit hard to do because that's just a really wide gap. But I'm hoping that even if they don't necessarily read every word, at least they can see the ideas and the suggestions. And then I was able to highlight those different locations. But for the History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, especially because I had to stay up all night writing and working on it. That one is the one that will probably always be one of my favorites. And I don't know that authors are supposed to do this, but I honestly wrote that book for me because I wrote it to answer all the questions that I had always had about places and why were certain homes where they were and who used to live here and what used to happen here and what really makes these certain locations distinct and why do we have a City Hall sign on the Lux Art Building and some of those different aspects that I've always wondered about. So haven't gotten a chance to do it yet, but one of the appendix chapters in that book is actually a list of some of the different residences that are found around the capital city. And the city of Lincoln had already organized that, but you had to look through all of the information and look through history permits and look through all of this that it was hard to find. And so I did a short summary of some of the significant houses found around town. And I arranged them then in order kind of by all of my books really have been written with regions in mind. So Detour Nebraska is organized according to 7 different regions across Nebraska. And A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln was also organized that way, other than there is a chapter on the schools. But even the chapter on the schools, I tried to arrange them through different parts because that's, I guess, how my mind works. And so probably for that was definitely a way that I could indulge my own curiosity and have an excuse to look up information I've always wondered about. I would say if you want to write, you just need to write. And at the beginning, even if you don't feel comfortable having an audience, I've been involved in different writing groups, and that's what they say all the time is just writing a little something every day. A blog definitely can be helpful because you can go back through and edit it. Unlike a book, if you make a mistake, it involves reprinting, and that doesn't work as well. But I would feel starting a blog and just starting to have more people read what you are writing, especially if you want to get published, that is important. And then pick an area to write that you are passionate about, because I think that enthusiasm does come through in your writing and everything like that. Different types of books are going to be easier to get published than others. I am a very rare writer, and this may not always be this way, but I was actually asked to write all 3 of my books. Now, obviously, I picked a niche topic. Not everyone is writing books on Nebraska, so that was in some ways to my advantage, even though I wasn't in any way strategic about that. And so that can be a little bit hard. I think if you write to be published, you may be disappointed. If you write for the love of writing, then you will always have a written product of your work. And even if you don't ever get it into printed form, there are so many options now to get self-published. And so if your family and friends enjoy your writing, that's a great place to start and find a few people that are willing to be honest with you about where you are writing and what you are writing about. And I think that that definitely helps. But the process can take longer than what people would ideally like. And so for me, from the beginning, I feel like that I was not necessarily writing because I wanted a huge audience. Although sometimes, even now, 7 years later, I feel like I wish that I had a lot more followers, or I wish some of those things, because, you know, it can be easy to compare yourself to different other writers. But yet at the same time, I've been able to have a lot of contact with people that read my books. And that is really ultimately what matters. I would much rather have more of a connection, because God only knows I could not handle having 1 million followers. That's way too much pressure. So, you know, you just have to start small and be willing to just keep moving forward the best that you can. Well, since I wrote 2 books in a relatively short amount of time, I know that my family would rather not have me write a lot of books right now. But we will see what exactly ends up happening. I would entertain if, especially since History Press has asked me to write 2 books, I feel like if this book, History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, does well, they may very well come to me with another offer in another year or 2. So I don't have anything specific under contract or anything like that. The one thing that I am trying to do is to catch up on some of my own posts and some of the things that I was interested in. At one point, I had started writing a little expert on each of the counties in Nebraska. I think that would be really fun. I also have entertained the idea of writing more about some of the governors in the state and some of the different people that ran for governor and the first ladies. I think that would be really fun. In one of the articles that I read for A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, I discovered that one of the governors ran against his college roommate. So there's just some interesting facts like that that are behind the scenes. I feel like a lot of people don't know about a lot of the State Hall of Fame people that have been introduced. And so these are things that may not ever be traditionally published, but I might do something with them just for my own interest and put them out there. But I don't have any contracts or anything right now, and I will not be seeking those out for a little while just because I need to keep up with the rest of my life.
Hello, everybody, from the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors at Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Diane Wilson. I'm curator of our collection here, which has a unique status in Lincoln City Libraries. It's funded by an endowment that's supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, which was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. The NLHA makes events like this possible through membership, programming, and fundraising efforts, and we're really grateful for their help. The mission of the Heritage Room is to preserve and promote literature by and about Nebraska authors. One way we do that is by providing the John H. Ames Reading Series as a venue for authors to share their books, which then enables our community of readers to learn about the great literary talent in our state. This is the 224th event since our first Ames reading in 1985. So today's program is a little different since it's being filmed in the Heritage Room without an audience. Due to the COVID-19 situation, the libraries are not holding events on site right now, so we decided it's time for the Ames Reading Series to go virtual. So today we're pleased to host author Gretchen Garrison. A Nebraska native, Gretchen began writing her blog, Odyssey Through Nebraska, back in 2013. This led to writing her first book titled Detour Nebraska, Historic Destinations and Natural Wonders, which was published in 2017. And then in 2019, she was given the opportunity to research and write two more books, both published in 2020. A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln was published in July, and 100 Things to Do in Lincoln Before You Die was published in September. Besides writing her blog and books, Gretchen has continued to write for other publications, including the magazines Lincoln Kids, Nebraska Life, and Elle Magazine. She and her husband, Kyle, live with their 4 children on an acreage west of Lincoln, where they operate their family business. So we're really happy to have Gretchen here and talk about her books today.
My name is Gretchen Garrison, and I'm really grateful to get to talk to you today. Before I talk about my second book, A History Lover's Guide to Lincoln, I do want to mention that this Heritage Room is one of my 100 things that you need to do in Lincoln. So you definitely, if you have never been up here, I highly suggest that you come and spend some time getting to know other Nebraska authors. So the book I'm going to talk to you about today is one that I subtitled A Travel Guide to Lincoln's History. And the one thing that I really enjoyed about researching this was I was able to find out some more about Lincoln through doing all of this research. And what is special to me is the fact that I grew up fairly close to Lincoln and have lived kind of in this area for all of my life. My dad was a family physician in the area, and then my mom was just involved in the community. And so one of the fun things about A History Lover's Guide was the fact that I actually got to include a picture of my parents and my husband, who was my fiance at the time, and my grandparents, because we had taken a picture in front of Billy's Restaurant, which is included in this book. So the introduction to this book is tells a little bit about some of the beginnings. And another fun thing about this book that I really enjoyed getting to include was this picture of the Capitol was at my grandparents' house on their living room wall for years. And so it was taken by a family friend. It looks like it's a modern drone picture, but no, I'm not totally sure how he took this picture, but it was taken in the 1970s, actually. Another thing that was great to be able to include in this book is one of the things that Lincoln is known for is how it came to be settled. Now, at the time when they decided to have Lincoln be the capital, it was a very small town of only about 30 residents. And they called it Lancaster. It was the name of the county, and it was the name of the town. And so what was going on in Nebraska at that time was historic, but they're not quite as historic inside. And so that's where the dual purpose of this book does work well, is because you can drive by and read about some of the stories of these early places without necessarily having to go inside some of them. But that part is definitely enjoyable. Besides talking about downtown, chapter 2 talks about the Haymarket. And what people may not realize is the Haymarket really was not called the Haymarket in the early days. It was just known as the market part. But there was a lot of booming businesses that started in the downtown Haymarket area. The third chapter tells more about the University of Nebraska and some of its history. And thankfully, there was a lot of great university histories to draw upon to help me to be able to tell some of the stories of some of the buildings. I happened to go to Architecture Hall on a time when Kay Logan Peters was working up in her architecture office. I had no idea that she was going to be there, and that woman is definitely an authority on university history. And so she happened to have time to give me an unofficial tour of the building and then to tell me some of the stories that ended up being able to be a part of the book. So that was, I think, the most fun about writing this book about Lincoln's history was talking to other people that were also invested and also know a lot of the stories. So while my name may be on the cover, if you look on the bibliography and look at the list of sources that I used, it is extensive because there's no way that I can tell a town's history without a lot of input from other people. So the University of Nebraska history is in here. I did take a lot of the pictures for this book, but I also did find some really great pictures in the Library of Congress site. And so this is actually a poster of Pershing. General John J. Pershing once taught and led some different military exercises here at the university. He's a well-known man, and you can go and visit the military hall. Still has some exhibits of him and his exploits. And so that was really fun. So besides telling about the university history of both the main Lincoln campus and East Campus, then what I ended up doing is a lot of times people do not realize that there were actually several small towns that became a part of Lincoln's history. And so Belmont was more of a region, but University Place and Bethany and Havelock were all original parts that were their own towns. And so because Lincoln is made up of several towns, that actually did give us several unique characteristics and some different things to note. For a while, Lincoln was called the Athens of the West. Both University Place and Bethany started out as college towns. Not the college towns we think of today, but definitely smaller communities that were built around the university. And some of those early Lincoln universities definitely struggled and needed people to provide input and to help with some of the funding and different things like that. Havelock was a railroad town, and so Havelock didn't struggle financially and had money to be able to do some different things in the beginning. So while some of these smaller university areas wanted to be included in Lincoln, Havelock resisted for a long time because they really didn't need Lincoln as much as Lincoln needed them. And one story that I tell in the book is one that I retold from one of Jim McKee's history books, and that is the fact that on October 29th, 1929, the first football game under the lights at west of the Mississippi was played in Lincoln, Nebraska. Actually, it was Havelock, Nebraska at the time. And so these hardworking railroad men wanted to be able to see their sons to play football. So they raised money to get lights to put on the field, and it was a big deal. And so they played one season under the lights. And at the time, they were also not only having the distinction of being first west of the Mississippi, they were the third team in the whole entire United States playing under the lights. So that was a rather big deal. But Lincoln was persistent, and in 1930 convinced Havelock that yes, they should be a part of Lincoln, and Havelock finally agreed. One of the first things that the city of Lincoln did was they took down the lights that these hardworking people of Havelock had raised money to get, and they moved them to a tennis court because they declared that Lincoln does not play football under the lights. So I don't know how long it took before Lincoln changed that tune, but Havelock did lose their lights forever. So besides telling about these northern parts of Lincoln, I also told about some of the military's connections. For a while, Lincoln had an Air Force base, so you can learn more about that. I told about Air Park and about Capitol Beach. And Capitol Beach at one time was a thriving amusement park. It's harder to find remnants of that park today, but there's definitely a lot of interesting history, including stories of how Lindbergh sort of learned to fly in Lincoln. There's some debate as to how much he really did, but it's still really interesting to learn more about Charles Lindbergh. Then I go to tell more about Fairview, which is the area where William Jennings Bryan lived, and then to tell more about Normal, which was never an official town, and then also College View. College View is another area that was a university here in Lincoln, and Union College is still a thriving university here. But one thing that is interesting too, because Lincoln did come from several small towns, is we actually have 5 Carnegie libraries in Lincoln. One has since been torn down, but you can still drive by some of these original libraries that were once a part of Lincoln's history. Actually, technically, another one has been torn down. We're standing at its location. Andrew Carnegie helped rebuild the Lincoln Downtown Library after there was a fire, and then eventually they had to replace it with a more modern building. So then, besides telling about these distinct locations, I also tell about South Lincoln, the Germans from Russia that settled this area, and some of the different things that they did. Some of the churches that were here in the south part of Lincoln were also interesting. There's an excerpt on Robbers Cave and what Lincoln was like in that underground area. One thing that we did struggle with, besides using my own pictures that were modern, I used some historic postcards in this book. And this picture of a waterfall that says on it, Falls Lincoln Park, Lincoln, Nebraska, was one that stumped me. And not only did it stump me, it stumped a lot of people in the Lincoln Parks and Rec Department and a lot of the historians that I asked to weigh in on where this was at. For one thing that was confusing, there were several Lincoln Parks that were in Lincoln, Nebraska at one time. So trying to figure out where they all were and exactly where these falls would be was tough. But at one point, I had an email going back and forth between several experts talking about where this could possibly be. And so what I ended up finally labeling it as is that it was probably a part of a dam and it was probably near Salt Creek. So even sometimes with all the efforts that you do, figuring out definitive history is different. But at first I thought there was never a waterfall in Lincoln. And so that was what the fun was about doing this book, was discovering things that I didn't even know were there. So one part of Lincoln that I struggled with figuring out how to identify is I ended up writing a chapter called A to Z Streets, because some of the places in the middle of Lincoln were harder to categorize. And so I found a really fun quote by Allen Ginsberg that said, "I rather admire a town courageous enough to name its main street Zero Street." And so that was kind of the basis of this chapter, was telling again more about some of the churches that were in this part of town, Wyuka Cemetery, and the Sunken Gardens. And so Sunken Gardens is mentioned in all three of my books because that is definitely a key part of history. For a while, Sunken Gardens was known as kind of the place to put extra tree limbs, and it was kind of overgrown. Sometimes it'll be described as a trash heap, and it's not really what you would think of as a dump, but more of a places where people would put brush, and it was the neighborhood sledding pile. And then in the Great Depression, they did change it into a garden. And what is great is to see how this continues to be a vibrant part of Lincoln's history. I was able to sit down with some of the organizers and learn more about some of the garden design and how they do yearly thematic plantings. And that was definitely enjoyable to get to hear more of the history of that. Besides all of the sections of Lincoln, I ended up writing a chapter on Lincoln schools. That was not what I thought I was going to do at the beginning, but the more I started uncovering the names of different schools and the fact that many of the schools are named for historic Lincoln people, Lincoln teachers, Lincoln administrators, Lincoln community members. And I love that because I feel like sometimes there's more of a distant approach to naming schools after presidents or maybe after trees or things like that. And Lincoln has named a lot of its schools after specific people. One that I discovered that was near the house that I lived for a long time in Lincoln is the Brownells. Now, the Brownells were both very much involved in education. He was a professor. Some of their children were professors. They married professors, and she was Mother of the Year for a while. And I really actually struggled to find her name because she was just always known as Mrs. Brownell for the longest time. But that was really an enjoyable part that I did not anticipate. And so what got all of that started is I went to Lincoln High on a tour, and Carter, who works there at Lincoln High, gave me a tour and gave me a book that told me some of Lincoln High's history, which is also really fascinating. They were one of the first places to perform an opera west of the Mississippi at a school. And so getting to tell some of those stories, I think all of us grow up with a certain amount of school spirit. And so to be able to pass that information along and to help people realize that there was a start and a beginning of that. Now, for the last part of the book, I do have a couple of appendixes, and I talk about the historical Lincoln residences around town based on parts of the city. And then I also talk about some of the Lincoln artists that contributed to the town, and then some of the architects, such as Davis Design, that built a lot of the prolific buildings in Lincoln. And so that was my goal again, was to connect people with some of the stories and to help them appreciate what all Lincoln has to offer. So I do hope that you enjoy History Lover's Guide to Lincoln. It was definitely a book that I put a lot of effort and research into. I enjoyed talking to church historians and some of the people that still operate places that are happening today. And so you can get this at a wide variety of places, including at the library. Thank you.